Hello everyone and welcome back to Average Nerd Talks. Now, if you've been using Linux for a while, you've probably heard these terms like Wayland or X11, and they're probably a little confusing. Also, you've probably heard of different desktop environments like Gnome, KDE, or XFCE, or Cinnamon, a bunch of them. In this video, I thought I'd discuss X11, Wayland, and a bunch of desktop environments and what they actually do. So back in the day, when computers first came out, the first consumer PCs used a command line interface in order to make it easier and more accessible to people. It led to the development of GUIs, right? So I think the first GUI was Xerox, if I'm not mistaken, which was then adopted by Apple and then Microsoft in their Windows computers. And GUIs started becoming a lot more popular. Linux also started off as a command line interface, and it used to be a really, really complicated system to use until the X display server came about sometime in the 80s. I think it was 1984, if I'm not mistaken, when the first release of X11 or X server came about. The latest iteration of X server, which is X11, was released in 2012, if I'm not mistaken. All right, we'll confirm all of that. But let's first dive into what X11 and Wayland and all of these things are. So starting with the X server or the X Windows system, which is typically known as X11, is actually a framework simply for drawing stuff on your screen. Now, drawing, moving windows, mouse and keyboard interaction, and all of this is basically handled by a display server. So you have to remember that the UI for your computer is not designed by X or X Windows System. X Windows System is only responsible for displaying stuff on your computer. So note that I'm calling it an X display server, but on a local computer, you have the X display server and the X display client running at the same time. I'll explain this better with a diagram. Now, this is the Wikipedia page for the X Windows system. Let's make this a little bit bigger so it's visible. Now, I'm not going to go over all of the points and the nitty-gritties here, but let's look at this little diagram. So when you have a workstation which is running on the X display server or the X11 system, you have a X server component, which is visible here. And everything that the X server is drawing, so like your browser or even your entire desktop environment and like your taskbar and everything that you're seeing on your computer, is essentially a client. Now, in this case, this X client here is a browser. In this case, it's Xterm. Xterm is simply a terminal emulator like GNOME term or whatever terminal you've used so far on a Linux computer. All of this stuff drawn by X server can also be accessed via a remote machine, which means one of the very, very unique things that X server could do was send Windows or send GUIs over a network. And this was actually one of the most critical and one of the most useful things that the X server had actually implemented. So now you may be thinking, okay, so if it's drawing everything, is it also responsible for spawning windows and for placing them and the appearance and all of that? No. So typically for X servers, you have a compositor, right? Or a window manager. So in GNOME, for example, you have something called the Mutter window manager. In KDE Plasma, I'll go over this in a little bit more detail later, but in KDE Plasma, you have something called a KWin compositor. So these window managers and these compositors, they talk to X server and they tell them, okay, so this is the GUI that I want, this is how I want it to look, and this is what you need to draw on the screen. Now, all the visual effects, like all those, those fading and translucency and all of those things, all the animations and VSync, this is all handled by the compositor, which means it's also handled by the window manager and compositor can kind of mixed together nowadays. So it's called a compositing window manager. So Mutter, Kwin, all of these are compositing window managers. All right. So these are what draw your visual effects and your vertical synchronization, animation, and all of that. So I'll give you a small demonstration of how you can actually access GUIs over a network. So I've got a local server here which is hosting some Docker images and some stuff for my home automation setup. So let me SSH into this server with the X flag. So this would be so this is my local server. This is running Ubuntu server on it. It's 22.04. I haven't upgraded it to 24 because I don't want to break anything. But anyway, so let me just see. I want to see all the files on it. Okay, so typically you can use the terminal to do it, but okay, let's say you don't want to use the terminal. Now I've installed a file manager on this. So file manager kind of like Explorer. So if I do Thunar, which is pretty common file manager out there. It's used by the XFCE desktop environment. So if I type in Thunar and press enter, I actually get a nice little GUI. And if you notice, it's saying Piyush at local server, which means it's running on my server. It's not running on my computer. And the interesting thing here is I can actually use it like any other application on my computer. So let's say I want to, so this is basically all the Dockers that I've got here. So let's say I double click on a text file. So this is a text file. This window here, this mouse pad, this is also not installed on my computer. This is again on the server. So I can edit this file, which is running on the server using a GUI on my computer. So I don't really need to remote access. So typically, if you want to access another computer over a network, typically you would do a remote access type of thing, right? Like you'd use something like TeamViewer, or maybe you use Google has something like that. It works in Chrome. I forgot what it is. But anyway, so you'd probably use something like that. Maybe even Parsec. I've heard Parsec does something similar. Anyway, so this X windowing system or X window server actually allows you to do this over a network without having to use any of these remote utilities, not even VNC or anything. You don't need any of that. Now, X11 also comes with its own set of issues. So for a regular desktop environment, if you don't need any of these, networking features, X11 is not exactly the best for workstations. And the reason is that it has issues with multi-monitor support. It has issues with variable refresh rate, and it also has issues with scaling. So now here's the thing. X11 typically draws everything as a rectangle. Okay, so literally everything, including your GUI, your monitor, everything is a rectangle. So if your monitor has is a 1080p monitor, so you basically have a 1920 by 1080 pixels rectangle on your screen, which is where other rectangles will be drawn, which is all your windows and everything within that rectangle. Okay, so if you have a multi-monitor setup, X11 is not going to draw two rectangles, because if you draw two rectangles, they are two independent displays which cannot interconnect to each other, right? Typically, when you have two displays or a multi-monitor setup, you want to be able to move windows between these monitors. So in order to deal with that, what X11 does is essentially creates one large rectangle which encompasses both monitors or all three monitors or all of your monitors all into one rectangle. In theory, this may sound like, okay, this actually works, right? But in practice, what ends up happening is that this rectangle has one single resolution, one single refresh rate, one single scaling factor. So if one of your monitors is a lower resolution monitor and you want to scale up your text, you have to scale everything in that one rectangle. So that's where X11 or the X display server kind of starts falling apart. Therefore, Wayland was introduced. Now, Wayland does away with the whole display server idea, and it provides a framework for interacting directly with your compositing window manager. If you look at this diagram, now this is, okay, this is very complicated, but let me break this down for you, okay? So forget about everything else, just look at this little red square here, okay? So here you have the way, oh, sorry about that. Here you have the Wayland compositor, right? So Wayland compositor would be an implementation of the Wayland protocol. So it could be Mutter or Kwin or Western, whatever. Basically, GNOME uses Mutter, KDE uses Kwin. So all of these essentially implement the Wayland compositor, right? If suppose you want to open an application like Inkscape, you want to open an application like KDE Plasma. KDE Plasma is basically KDE's whole freaking desktop environment. GNOME Video, all of these have a underlying graphics library. In this case, it is EGL. Now, EGL, I'm not going to go over this in a whole lot of detail, but EGL is basically a interface written in OpenGL by the Kronos group. Now, Kronos group is the same people who are behind some OpenGL APIs. They're also behind Vulkan, by the way. They are the ones who invented or made that. So EGL is basically a layer which allows your applications to talk to the Wayland compositor, and they allow the Wayland compositor to basically ask EGL to draw, stuff on your screen, like rectangles or whatever it is that X display server used to do. But the advantage of using EGL is, since it's a graphics library, it can directly use your graphics card. So this green little box here, right, that is Mesa 3D. This is basically your graphics card drivers. So basically Wayland is able to directly interact with your, sort of interact with your graphics card in order to draw things on your screen, which is something that the X display server makes kind of difficult to do. Now, I'm not going to discuss the kernel level stuff here because this can get a little complicated, but this is basically the gist of how Wayland works. Now, you remember I said the compositors or the compositing window managers are what are responsible for implementing effects and variable refresh rate and fractional scaling and all of those things. Now, since the compositor itself is implements Wayland in itself and it's using a graphics card to draw everything, it's possible for them to include variable refresh rate within the compositor itself. It's possible for them to do fractional scaling. It's possible for them to do vertical synchronization, vsync, all of that within the compositor itself. And it can also support multiple different monitors without any kind of issue. However, this makes a few things a little more difficult. For example, the X display server made it very easy for you to share windows, because since everything was essentially an X client, right? You could just pass whatever that window is showing to whatever screen sharing application you want, and it would display that. Wayland, however, does not have an API or does not have a built-in way of doing this. So this kind of thing needs to be implemented independently or separately. So screen sharing can sometimes be a problem. Now, of course, this has been improved a lot. I mean, I am screen sharing right now through OBS and you're able to see my screen without any problems. So it has improved a lot, and screen sharing is now part of most desktop environments and mostly works just fine. However, displaying stuff over a network is not something that Wayland can do. So if you are a systems administrator or something, and you're trying to manage a remote system and you want like GUI applications to display on your computer as if they were native, then you probably would want to stick to the X display server for now, because I don't think Wayland has an implementation that's kind of similar to what X could do. Now, desktop environments like GNOME, KDE and such, they essentially describe the GUI of your computer. So the X display server does not implement a GUI, it just is responsible for drawing the GUI, but you need something that actually describes it. So GNOME, KDE, all of these, that's essentially what they do. Ubuntu and Fedora use GNOME by default. Linux Mint uses Cinnamon, and OpenSUSE and Nubara use KDE by default. So every Linux operating system needs a, well, not every, but most consumer Linux operating systems need a desktop environment in order for them to have a described GUI or a UI. So for example, Gnome, KDE, Cinnamon, all of these are desktop environments. Now these are what describe what your GUI or your UI is supposed to look like. And your X display server essentially draws this UI as rectangles or stuff like that. Now, Wayland also is kind of doing the same thing. So if you've used something like Ubuntu in the past, or if you've used Fedora's workstation environment, you've probably seen Gnome. Gnome is relatively simple to use. It's got its own design philosophy. I know they say it's intuitive and efficient and finely crafted, but I'm not personally a huge fan of the way GNOME does things, but that's just my opinion. You can use whatever you're comfortable with. I do have GNOME on my laptop and I have been using it for a while now, but I have configured it a little bit to make it, more suited to my style of, doing work or my workflow. You also have KDE Plasma. Now, KDE Plasma typically looks a bit more like Windows out of the box. So if you are more used to using Windows, you probably find that KDE looks and works a lot more like it. However, KDE is extremely customizable, and you can actually do whatever it is that you want with it. You can make it look like a Mac, you can make it look like Windows, you can make it look and function like literally whatever you want. So as you can see, probably Steam Deck is one of the most, forefront and one of the most popular devices which actually come bundled with KDE by default. KDE is also available as a spin for Fedora. It's also available with Kubuntu, which is a KDE version of Ubuntu. It's also the default for OpenSUSE or OpenSUSE. I don't know how you pronounce that, but OpenSUSE. That's how that's how I say it. It's also the default for Navara. Now, KDE is also a little more performant when it comes to games and stuff and graphical applications as compared to GNOME. So you might want to use that if you're probably going into gaming or any kind of 3D work. Another pretty popular desktop environment used by Manjaro primarily is XFCE. It's also used by MX Linux. It's one of their flagship environments. Now, XFCE is relatively very lightweight, very simple. It probably will remind you of something like Windows 98. So if you look at some of the screenshots right here on their webpage, you'll see that it looks very old, dated. I know these terms have been used a lot for XFCE based environments. They're very ancient looking. You can make it look really nice. So this is OpenSUSE running XFCE. Some of the older, so these are some of the older versions of XFCE, which are downright ugly. But yeah, the newer versions, they can actually be themed quite a lot. So you can make it look really nice and really pretty. If you look at Manjaro, for example, it actually has a really nice implementation of XFCE. So does MX Linux. They implement it really well. But now here's the thing. GNOME and KDE both have a default Wayland implementation. So if you go back to this diagram, you notice in the Wayland compositor, you've got Mutter, Kwin. Mutter and Kwin are for GNOME and KDE respectively. Weston, Weston, is the reference window manager for Wayland. So when Wayland was first introduced and was demonstrated to be in a protocol, basically for demonstration purposes, Weston is what's typically used. Now there are a bunch of other implementations like Clayland, Enlightenment, which are not all that common. You can look into them if you want, but yeah, I mean, the most common ones are Mutter and Kwin. Now, Linux Mint Cinnamon uses something called Muffin Window Manager, which is basically a fork of the Mutter Window Manager by GNOME. Now, the problem with Muffin is it is X11 by default, and it doesn't really support Wayland right now. So it does support Wayland, but it's kind of experimental at this point. So it would, take some time for it to have, proper Wayland support and proper implementation of Wayland. If you're into gaming on Linux, typically if you have a FreeSync or G-Sync monitor and you have a multi-monitor setup, I would recommend you use Wayland, especially for multi-monitor setups. If you have a single monitor setup, however, X11 does have variable refresh rate implementations, especially in GNOME, also in KDE. So GNOME and KDE typically should be fine regardless of whether you're using X11 or Wayland. But yeah, if you've got more than one monitor, definitely Wayland. There's no way to use variable refresh rate or anything of the sort with X11 and multiple monitors. So that was a brief overview of X11, Wayland, and a bunch of different desktop environments which actually implement Wayland and X11. I haven't covered everything in this video, and there's a whole lot of details which I've skimmed over. If there's anything that I've missed that you think other users should know, make sure you note that down in the comments below. If you like this video, hit like. If you didn't like it, hit dislike. Make sure to subscribe if you like content like this. Thank you everyone for watching. Stay safe. I'll see y'all in the next one.